So welcome everyone. My name is Teresa Gauman and I'm a customer service librarian here at the Oshawa Public Libraries. And I just wanted to say welcome to our Meet the Author event with Joanna Goodman. Before we get started into the event, I would like to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So the land we are standing on or sitting on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as a settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. And at this time, I'd like to just acknowledge that we may not all be sitting on the same territorial lands. So I would encourage you, if you are comfortable or if you know, you can share which lands you are zooming in from, and you can share that in the chat with us. We have joined with Blue Heron Books. So I don't see anyone specifically here right now, but I did want to mention Blue Heron Books, and I've included their website in the chat. So if you are interested, you can definitely pop over to their website and purchase the book. I have also included Joanna's website as well. Okay, so let's get started. So before we get started, I'm going to read a biography, a quick little bio on Joanna. And we are so very excited to have Joanna here with us today. So Joanna Goodman is the author of 6 novels, including the #1 national bestseller, The Home for Unwanted Girls, which was on the Globe and Mail's fiction bestseller list for more than 6 months, as well as The Forgotten Daughter and The Finishing School. Both national bestsellers, her stories have appeared in The Fiddlehead, B&A Fiction, Event, The New Quarterly, and Whitewall Review, as well as excerpted in Elizabeth Harver's fiction anthology, A Room at the Heart of Things. Originally from Montreal, Joanna now lives in Toronto with her husband and 2 kids. She is currently at work on her next novel, The Gold Diggers, which hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit about later. So welcome, Joanna. Thank you so much. We are so excited to have you here today and can't wait to hear what you have prepared for us.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joanna. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. Always fun to talk about, what I like to think of as kind of like my life story and my mom's life story in Montreal, which is one of my favorite subjects. And I'll just say that right before this session, I sort of reached out and asked if we were talking about just Forgotten Daughter or The Home for Unwanted Girls. I'm actually never sure anymore because they kind of are 2 parts of one. I find it more challenging to talk about Forgotten Daughter without referencing The Home for Unwanted Girls, which is really the first book in the sequence. And so this is The Home for Unwanted Girls, in case you have not seen or read it. And this is The Forgotten Daughter. And I'm actually going to talk about both because, as I said, I really find it challenging to focus only on Forgotten Daughter and not include where it began. So, and, just a little insight into why it is 2 books. Originally, I wanted my vision for the book, and you may have read this or heard this about me, but I did start Home for Unwanted Girls over 20 years ago when I was still in university. And my original vision was to write this epic saga that would span from like the 40s all the way to the 2000s. I wanted to have every single thing that ever happened in, the province, the FLQ and the referendums and Duplessis and all the things. But of course, as I really got into the book and it was starting to take shape and the Duplessis orphan part came to be, I realized that really this was a 2-book situation. And so I wrote Home for Unwanted Girls, and I kind of ended it in the early 70s where it felt organically like that story was coming to an end. And although I had all the research done around the referendums and the FLQ, and also that was, I was in my 20s in the 90s. That was kind of my era, and I was working as a journalist. I had so much research, but I really just had to like put it away and hope there would be a second book. And right when Home came out, my editor, who is in New York, from HarperCollins, called me and asked me if I would want to do a follow-up. And I was like, yes, I had it all ready to go. And so while the first one took like 20 years on and off, the second one took exactly 1 year. Because really it was all the research. So that's why for me, to me, they're one whole. I hope if you haven't read the second or the first or whatever, you can still totally follow that. So for me, I grew up in Montreal, and my mom also grew up in Montreal, and she was the daughter of a French Canadian woman, very, very, very poor, very, very, very unhappy. And her father was, as in the book, an English merchant. He had a seed store, which was actually true. And he was called the Seed Man. They were in the East End. They weren't in the Eastern Townships. But my mom grew up, her and her 6 brothers and sisters, with this dual identity. My grandmother refused to speak English. She would not learn English. She would not speak it in the house. She would not speak to the kids in English. And so they did not speak a word of English until they went to English school at 5 years old. And that was where my grandfather won out, and he was like, they're going to English school. So when my mom started kindergarten, she didn't speak a word of English. And she always used to talk about that first day where, everyone was just like, she didn't understand a word. And from that day forward, it was when she was in her neighborhood in the East End with all the French kids on her street. They made fun of her for being English and maudite anglaise. And then when she went to school and she was in English school, they called her Pepsi and Frog and Pea Soup and all those things. So she had always talked about this. My whole life, she talked about the impact of being both or neither one or the other, and how that impacted her life. And it always stayed with me. It really left an impression. And I too experienced it. I grew up, I was a little kid in the 80s, and there was the first referendum. And then I was in my early 20s in the second referendum. And the tensions in the 90s were very, very, very high between the French and the English. There was all the constitutional talks, and I was working downtown, and if I said hello as a greeting, you could feel the the tension coming back at you. That scene in the McDonald's where Véronique in the second book is with her dad and they're ordering. That happened to me too. I ordered a quarter pounder one time, and the person working at McDonald's told me to get in another line and order in English if I wanted to. So that was what it was like. That was what it was like. And so it always had interested me. And being a writer, I started writing at 5. I always wanted to tell my mom's story. And so when I was in my 20s, I started this first version of a novel. And it was going to be very simple. It was going to be a love story, like a kind of Romeo and Juliet between a French Canadian girl, an Anglo girl, half English, half French, but really always after her English father's approval, and this poor French Canadian blue collar factory working farmer, and their love story. And that's really all I had at the time. And I just loved the whole era, and I was researching the seed world, and I was young, so I would work on it a bit and then kind of put it aside and then go back to it. And over the years, I wrote other novels that actually got published first. I always had the sense that this was going to be a bigger thing. And even my agent was like, it's not ready, put it back in the drawer. So over the years of, doing research, I came across the story of the Duplessis Orphans. And I have to say, as someone who grew up in Montreal, never had heard about the Duplessis Orphans, never learned about it, absolutely never learned about it. And when I came across that little piece of Quebec/Canadian history, my mind was blown. I couldn't believe it. I do remember, and I will, if anyone doesn't know, I will go into it a bit, but I do remember in my 20s when the Duplessis orphans were grown, they started coming forward, as in the Forgotten Daughter, protesting, filing lawsuits. They formed a coalition, and it was in the news a lot. And so I do remember seeing headlines, Duplessis orphan. I remember one that said sodomized by a priest. Like, I'll never forget that. But what I thought it was just, not just, but I thought it was, the typical mistreated orphans, which was rampant all over. I mean, Ireland, everywhere we hear of abused orphans. And that's what I thought it was. And I think, gauging from how few people have ever heard about what really happened, I'm going to say that, there was an assumption for anyone who didn't probe that this was a story of orphans who had been abused, and it ended there. When in fact, again, for those of you who have not read the books or do not know what I'm talking about, in 1950, Premier Duplessis, who was, he was a terrifying leader. He was a tyrant. He ruled. He was premier for decades. Extremely closely tied to the Catholic Church, and determined to keep the province uneducated, rural, and backwards. And that era was called the Great Darkness, because he kept the province so backwards, and the Catholic Church and the province were so intertwined, and it was very shady, to say the least. In 1950, he made a decision to convert all the orphanages in the province, like every single orphanage, into a mental institution. And basically what that meant was, his decision was to convert all these orphans into mental patients. And the reason being money. The federal government paid 3 times as much subsidies for mental patients as they did for orphans. So this was a huge windfall for the church and the province. And the money went directly into the pockets of the church and the province. And they calculated it in modern day into millions and millions, and I believe it's $70 million made off of that conversion. And so what happened on that day, it was literally one day, it was called Change of Vocation Day. All the orphans were kind of brought into their, schoolrooms or their classrooms, and they were told that there would be no more school, no more education. And going forward, they would be mental patients. And doctors were brought in, and these children were diagnosed, falsely diagnosed. It could be anything from, it was all made up. So it could be, mentally deficient. In those days, they used the R word, mentally insane, danger to themselves, whatever it was. They would have a 5-minute question and answer period. Say the alphabet, what is this picture of? And they weren't very well educated, because they were orphans. So they were just deemed, mentally challenged, and that was it. Bars went up on the windows of the orphanages, and actual mental patients were brought into the schools, and the children had to start taking care of them. Eventually, these orphans were shipped off to real mental hospitals, where they were locked up on the psychiatric wards. The boys were in one building, the girls were in another, and they were treated like, the worst of the worst mental patients. They were put in straitjackets, they were chained up, they were physically, sexually, mentally abused. They were given tranquilizers daily. They were tested on electroshock therapy, lobotomies were common, like just a horrific experience. And that went on until the 60s. And so when I came across that story, as I said, I was so shaken, and it had never been my intention to write a book about it. But as soon as I read and I started going down the rabbit hole of the research, I knew I had to tell, like, I had to tell this story. And I knew, like, it kind of just was like, Maggie, who is the main protagonist of the first book, is going to get pregnant and have a baby out of wedlock. Because a 15-year-old who got pregnant in Quebec in those days, you did not keep your babies. And I was going to have her child grow up in that system. And the book then went from being a love story between Gabrielle and Maggie, and really a love story between mother and daughter, and their search for each other. And, you know, will they come together? Will they find each other? The impact of not having the other in each other's lives. And so the book took a completely different course. And at that point, it really came together. It wasn't long after I really went there, because earlier versions of the Home for Unwanted Girls, you never actually met Elodie, who's the orphan. I was too scared to go there. And so you heard about her in a distant chapter, but you never met her. And the whole book was Maggie's story, and there was something missing. And finally, my editor was like, I'm sorry, but you got to go there. We've got to meet this child, watch her grow up. We need to be in that institution and understand what's happening. And so I went back, and I wanted to, I think it was really important for me not to have the reader there for too long. And so I liked the way it would go, you know, back and forth between Maggie's life and Elodie, and they're kind of growing up together. And, you know, there was a lot of editing involved in the orphan abuse, because it was so extreme that it was almost not plausible. So there was a lot of pulling back on it. But yeah, so that's how the first book kind of came to be. And then the second book picks up in the 90s, which was really like my era. I was a journalist intern at the time. I was working for Reuters. I was in my last year of university. It was 1995, and it was the referendum. And I was covering the referendum as an intern for Reuters because I was bilingual. And so I was at Metropolis the night of the actual referendum for the no side. I went outside, and there was this riot happening in the street that I remember calling my editor, and he was like, just stay with it and see what happens. And so I was in that riot, which I wrote about. Even that moment where there was a kid, I will never forget this. He was about my age at the time, so early 20s. He was on his knees, he was handcuffed, and he was screaming, c'est pas fini, it's not over. And I was so struck by this kid's passion. Like, it really, I don't know, it just left such an impression. And at that time, I knew I was going to write my book about Quebec. And I was like, that's going in my book. And luckily I was able to include it in The Forgotten Daughter, because it was such an impactful moment in my life. I was also at the rally the day before the referendum, where, you know, all the people from Canada came in, and it was incredibly emotional. And I have all kinds of stories and notes and all kinds of things from that day and from the actual referendum. I have all the news articles I wrote. And so for me, the research for this second book was so much easier. I had everything in writing. And also I had my memories, because I kind of lived that era in Montreal. So the second book was the book where I could actually really do my love story between, you know, the hardcore separatist Véronique, whose father was an FLQ terrorist, and the journalist who, though French, is a no hardcore anti-separatist. And it's really, and then the other key thing that I wanted to include in that book was Elodie's, I hate to say revenge, I like to say redemption, because we go through so much with her in the first book. And I really wanted her to have her comeuppance in a way. And so I saw this book, and that's why the 90s was such a great era there was so much going on with the referendums and the politics, and the orphans were coming forward, and they were on the news a lot, and they were telling their stories. And it was an opportunity for me as a writer to let Elodie have her moment, to have her confrontations, to, face off with the doctors and the nuns, and have her say, and she comes into her own in that book. And what inadvertently happens is her presence in Veronique's life, who is so lost and on such a, destructive path. Elodie's influence brings Veronique back, into a whole new way of being in the world. Because as a girl who was raised by a man who murdered someone for his cause and went to jail for his cause, he raised her to live outside the law and see that as a noble calling. And I think at some point in the book, the hope is that Veronique, through her friendship with Elodie, through her relationship with James, she eventually comes to a reckoning point where she's asking herself, is the criminal life really as noble as I keep pretending it is? And so for me, the two of them kind of come full circle. And, one I see as the story of my mom's life, though she didn't get pregnant out of wedlock, and the other kind of is a bit mine. So that's really in a nutshell how they came to be, and what they mean to me. And I mean, I'm happy to take questions for as long as we like. I always find the discussion gets a lot more interesting when questions start coming along.
Hi, Joanna. We're so happy to have you here. I grew up in Montreal as well, although I'm a fair bit older than you. So I remember the first referendum in 1970, the FLQ crisis in 1970, I was 13 years old. And the first referendum in 1980, I had just graduated university and I was working in Old Montreal, and we'd get into the elevator and I had a button, no merci. And then a lot of the people had the oui buttons, and you could cut the tension with a knife for sure. My grandmother was Irish and my grandfather French Canadian. My mother was a Legault, but her mother tongue was English. But I've always been fascinated or horrified by the Duplessis era. And my question for you is, you didn't know about them. Where was your research? Was a lot of it online, or did you go to the archives? Was there plentiful research about that dark time?
For me, the research era spanned years and years. I mean, when I first started researching the 50s in Quebec, and Duplessis, not the orphans, but just because he was the premier, and my mom used to talk about how terrifying a presence he was. So that probably would have been late 90s, early 2000s. So the internet was very crude. There was not a lot. And that's, I had books on Quebec and everything, and no mention of the orphans. As the internet kind of started to explode, and I was still researching, because as I said, I would work on it for a while and then put it away. And I wrote, so if you happen to notice the chronology, the Home for Unwanted Girls is actually my 5th book, I think. So although I had started it in my early 20s, I did write and publish four other. So I would go back to it, and then there would have been an explosion of information on the internet. And at some point going back, there was so much. And that's when I discovered it. There are almost no books about it whatsoever. And one of the reasons being, they were not educated. The orphans were not educated. They could not read, they could not write. And so there are very few firsthand accounts. One man who wrote a book was actually the only orphan of all the thousands of them that actually had an education. And the only reason he had an education was because one of the nuns recognized how smart he was when he was young, when he was in the system. And she got him out. She got him into a family when he was in his early teens. And he went on to get a degree and become a professor, and I think a lawyer. And he was the lawyer for this coalition. And so he wrote a book. And then the only other book I actually found that was a firsthand experience was called The Duplessis Orphans by Alice Quinton, and it was told to a writer. And it was, it gave me so much insight because the internet is full of news stories. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles. There are now videos, there are documentaries, there are interviews with the orphans. You can watch CBC News clips of their actual protests. There's a wealth of information about it, which is interesting considering nobody in the world knows about it, but you can find tons. But in terms of an actual insight of an inner journey and experience firsthand, I found one book. It was in French. It was published in the 80s. I had to find it secondhand. I had to read it in French. But it was such an eye-opener in terms of things like what went on in her head when she got out in her early 20s and was in the world for the first time, and that constant, like, do they think I'm crazy? Do they know I'm crazy? Like, she knows she's not crazy, but you're told you're crazy for 20 years. The seeing children on the street and being shocked that they were laughing together without fear of being beaten. The first potato she peeled, like all these things were in her. So while there's so much information on the internet about the actual abuse and what they went through and the facts, this book that I found was a really in-depth insight into what it was like for them to experience that and then be thrown into the world when they were let out. And I had made a decision not to speak to any actual of the Duplessis orphans, because if you've read the book, you can see the kind of material and what they went through. And I did not want to be beholden to one person's story. I didn't want the pressure of it not being accurate enough, or like